Welcome to the first annual Inclusion Fusion Special Needs Ministry Web Summit sponsored by Key Ministries and PajamaConference.com. This is Jolene Philo, and I'm excited to be here with you today talking about the topic, 10 Ways Churches Can Minister to Parents of Kids with Special Needs. Before I begin, let's bow for a word of prayer. Dear Father, thank you so much for bringing us here together today. Thank you for the technology that's making it possible for people all over the country to join together and learn more about how we can include families of kids with special needs in our churches. Be with us as we talk today about these ministry ideas. Stir our hearts. Show us how we can make them work where we live. And be with me that the words I speak may be what you know the people listening and watching need to hear. We ask all this in your Son's name. Amen. Well, if someone had told me about 10 years ago that I would now be speaking on the topic of special needs ministries, I would have been flabbergasted. I had no idea at that time that that was where God was leading me. But now as I look back, I can see how over my entire life, God has prepared me for this particular ministry. In fact, it began when I was only 2 years old. At that time, my father was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. That was 1959. He was 29 years old. In a year or two, he was unable to work. My parents had 3 kids under the age of 5. My parents decided right then that they would have Dad live in our home with us, if possible, until all of my siblings and I were out of the house, had graduated from high school and even from college. And by the grace of God, my parents were able to do that. In 1983, when my dad developed diabetes, he moved to a nursing home where he lived for the last 14 years of his life. But until then, he was in our home. So my brother and sister and I grew up in the 1960s with a rather unusual parenting model for that time. We learned a lot of skills that most other kids in that day and age didn't have. For example, we knew how to get Dad's wheelchair, whip him around if he needed to go through a doorway, tip him back a little bit on those big back wheels, and pull him out through the door backwards. Another skill that we had that maybe wasn't real prevalent in those days was we knew how to empty a urinal. My dad's multiple sclerosis had weakened his bladder control, so his urinal went with him wherever he was. He usually found a discreet little corner, or we would wheel him into the bathroom or whatever. And after he was finished, we would take that urinal. We knew how to dump it out, rinse it out, get it back in his bag discreetly, so nobody else around even knew what we were doing. But my favorite skill that we learned as kids of my father was by the time we were all about 7 years old, we knew how to fill a pipe with Kentucky Club pipe tobacco, tamp it down just exactly right, give it to Dad so he could put it in his mouth, put the stem in his mouth, and then we would light his pipe for him. And we were pretty good at it. We didn't even think that it was anything unusual. Another thing that we realized as we were growing up was how inaccessible many places were for people in a wheelchair. Our church was hard for Dad to get into. Schools were difficult. The library he couldn't even go to because it had too many steps. A year before my dad died, or before my dad went into a nursing home, my husband and I had our first child. Now, we didn't know there was anything wrong with Alan until about 12 hours after he was born, when he was having trouble breathing. So the doctor transferred him to a regional hospital about 40 miles from where we were, where they diagnosed Alan with a tracheal esophageal fistula. That meant that his esophagus came down from his stomach, or came down from his throat and made a blind pouch. It came up from his stomach and hooked into his trachea. So he needed surgery immediately if he was to live. He was life-flighted from Rapid City, South Dakota to the University of Nebraska Hospital in Omaha, where they performed that surgery before he was 24 hours old. He had a pretty quick recovery, was dismissed from the NICU after about 2.5 weeks. He seemed to have no other issues, but at 2 months he developed some complications that led to a number of surgeries before we got everything functioning correctly. By the time Alan was 5, he'd had a total of 7 surgeries and hundreds of procedures to get his esophagus functioning correctly. After that, he was in good health until he was about age 15, where he had one final surgery in Kansas City. And we began to see some behavioral issues surface also as he went in through adolescence. We thought that possibly those could have been related to what had happened to him as a very young child, but it took about 10 more years before we found someone that was able to diagnose him with post-traumatic stress disorder. And so he was 26 when he went through treatment for that. Since then, he's been doing fine. He's married. He and his wife look forward to starting a family. He has a good job. But in addition to my family, God prepared me in many other ways for this ministry. I was a teacher for 25 years in the public school system, an elementary teacher, and I did have a learning disabilities minor, so I often had kids with special needs in my classroom. I attended a lot of IEP meetings. I started the IEP process for many students in my classroom, and I was very comfortable collaborating with special education teachers. I left education in 2003 to begin my writing and speaking work, and I also was part-time director of assimilation and discipleship at our church during those for 4 years. Now, if you aren't sure what that means, my job title was pretty much everything nobody else was in charge of. So I wasn't the youth pastor, and I wasn't the teaching pastor, and I wasn't the secretary, but most other things I usually did. During those 4 years, I learned a lot about how church staff works together, how a church works, and how God works through them. During those 4 years, I was doing a lot of writing on a lot of different topics, but there seemed to be this slow funneling in my writing so that the things that I wrote about special needs were the ones that got the biggest response. And as I was doing that writing, I discovered that there was not much on the topic of parenting kids with special needs, at least in the Christian arena. And so the idea for my first book, A Different Dream for My Child, Meditations for Parents of Critically and Chronically Ill Children, grew from that knowledge, and it was an attempt to kind of address the needs of parents of kids with special needs. And then 2 years later, that book came out in 2009. Now in 2011, right now, my new book, Different Dream Parenting, is being released. And in the writing of those two books, I interviewed a lot of families, probably over 50 or 60 families who had kids with a variety of different special needs, and I interviewed a number of professionals in the field. And it was from what I learned from those interviews that the content of this workshop was developed. The 10 ideas, the 10 ways churches can minister are a direct result of what parents told me they needed and what I found churches are able to offer. Now, I know that you have limited manpower and limited budgets in your churches, so the ideas that I've developed here are practical things that any member of your church body could do. They are not complicated. They do not require you to set up a new program. What they do require are compassionate and willing hearts. So let's start by looking at the first way churches can help families. Families really, most of all, need the presence of their church family after they receive a diagnosis of a special need, or as they begin dealing with a chronic illness or a chronic situation and the caregiving that goes along with that for a child with special needs. They need your presence much more than they need platitudes or little comforting sayings that you might have. For example, never say to a family, "I know how you feel," unless you have been in their situation and you do know how they feel. In that case, what you have to say might be comforting. Otherwise, don't say it, because you really don't understand what it's like to have a child with special needs. Now, if you're not sure how to be present with a family who has a child with special needs, here's some advice from a father I interviewed for my first book. He and his wife lost their oldest child when she was 3. She had leukemia. And if she had lived, she would be in her early 30s now. Since then, Jeff, the father, and his wife, Carolyn, have both devoted themselves to helping educators and children understand more of what it means to grieve and teaching other people how to help them grieve. And so Jeff facilitates a class for teachers that trains them to help children go through the grieving process. Well, there was a substitute teacher who took his class who also was a pastor. And he shared during one of the sessions how he uses something called the 3 H's when he goes to minister to families who have either lost children or are raising a child with special needs. He suggests that you remember these 3 things. Just be sure you hush. Just be quiet when you're with them. You don't really always need to say anything. Just be there. Hug. That one's pretty self-explanatory. And then the third one is hear. Just remember that they need you here with them, that the families want you here and be with them. So whenever you have the opportunity to be present with a family who has a child with special needs, just remember they could use you to hush, hug, and be here. Let's move on to the second way that churches and people in the church can minister to families of kids with special needs. These families need someone often, especially after diagnosis, to be a buffer for or the bearer of bad news. They may need you to go with them after they receive the diagnosis. They may need someone to go with them who's not part of the family to be a support to them while they break the news to grandparents, siblings of the child, aunts and uncles, cousins, those who are close to the child. If distance is an issue, for example, if one parent and the child are off somewhere at a hospital receiving the diagnosis, and the other parent is back at home going to work and maybe caring for other siblings, you may need to be a third party to help break the news to that other parent. You may get a phone call from the parent who just received the diagnosis asking you to go over and be with the rest of the family while they call and tell them what has happened. So you may need to help out, step in that fashion. And the family may also need some advice from you on how they tell the child who has the special needs or a diagnosis and how they tell the other siblings what's going on. And here's some just basic advice on how to do that. There is more information about this in my new book, Different Dream Parenting. But here's basically what you do for 3 different age groups. If you're dealing with preschoolers, tell them in very concrete terms what's happening only in the immediate future. You need to be honest with them, but don't be overly graphic, and don't really tell them more than what's happening in the next day or 2. They really can't comprehend or think that far ahead. Now, if you're dealing with children who are elementary age, they also need that concrete language. They don't need figurative language or abstracts. They need concrete language and basic information. Then after you've given that to them, you need to allow an elementary age child to ask you any questions that they've come up with, and then answer them again as honestly as possible. You can go a little bit further out with them. They may be able to handle what's happening next week or next month, but anything beyond that, again, is beyond their scope of understanding of time. Now, if you're dealing with siblings or a child who's in junior or senior high, you need to treat them as you would an adult. If the child is getting a diagnosis, they should be with you, with the doctor when that diagnosis is given, and be allowed to ask questions as an adult would. And the same if you're breaking the news to a sibling. You need to allow them to ask questions and speak to them as you would to an adult. Now let's move on to the third way that you can help families. They need you to be sensitive to their changing emotional needs. Now, immediately after receiving a diagnosis, whether it's of a newborn, of a child that's a little bit older where they've suspected something for a while, or an illness or an accident, parents' emotions after they receive that diagnosis will change by the minute. You may be with the family for a while one day and think that they're doing quite well, they're handling everything very well, but the next day you talk to them, or even later that day, and somebody in the family is a basket case. They're asking questions like, what did I do wrong? How can this be happening to me? Why is God doing this to us? And you may be thinking to yourself, did I read them all wrong earlier? Was I way off base? And the answer is no. What's happening is the parents are grieving. They're grieving and adjusting to the loss they've just been dealt, whether it's a loss through death or whether it's a loss of their dreams for a child. because this diagnosis means the child's life is not going to be what they expected it to be. And as they adjust, they're going to cycle through the stages of grief over and over. And so their emotions are going to be changing as that happens. And we'll be talking about those stages of grief in just a little bit, so hang on for more information about that. Families also need someone who's going to listen to them very closely and be sensitive to needs that they don't even realize they have and can't even verbalize. At different times, you can minister just by listening, by being a sounding board, letting them talk and share those emotions while they express their doubts and their fears without you pressuring them and by passing judgment or spouting doctrine they're not ready to hear. You need to provide resources for them instead. Listen to them, offer to pray with them, and assure them that their support system is in place. Now, eventually, you're going to be able to use the Bible to help them through the questions that they have. We had some friends that did that for us. I went through a period of great questioning when Alan was going through a lot of his issues before he was even a year old. And I was doing a lot of that, asking, why, God? What's happening? Is this punishment for me? Did I do something wrong? And we asked the pastor of a neighboring church to come and help us by doing a Bible study with us. Now, my husband says that we studied the book of James with these friends over several months. I can't even remember what we studied. What I do remember is that week after week, this young family came and talked to me and listened to me and prayed with me and used scripture to answer my questions. And after that, I was in a much better place than I had been before. So that's the kind of thing we need to do to help families who have a variety of emotional needs. The fourth thing we can do is a little more practical. Families need someone to handle logistics. Parents during this time are very focused on caring for their child. So the church can minister by providing someone who has some administrative skills to handle the logistics that are coming up. For example, if there's a lot of travel involved with this child's diagnosis, maybe someone from your church can handle travel arrangements so the family doesn't have to. Someone in your church may be able to see if there are funds available for unexpected medical expenses or travel expenses the family may incur. Maybe they'll do a fundraiser or just pass the hat and raise money for families. Someone in your church can do that. Other things, they can help with lodging. When our son was very young, when he was newborn, and we were in Omaha, they didn't even have Ronald McDonald houses, but we had some people in town who were friends, old friends of the family, and we were able to stay with them. You as a church may be able to find some of those resources so a family can find lodging that's affordable. Same thing with spiritual support. When our son had his surgery at age 15 down in Kansas City, we really didn't know anyone in that area. But a woman from our church had grown up there, and she called her pastor, and he came and stayed with us while Alan went through surgery. That was very helpful for us. Other things that you might be able to help with logistically as a church, finding care for the other siblings, finding someone who will watch the house if the family is gone for a while, someone who will go through and check the pipes, check the furnace, the air conditioner, mow the lawn, take care of the mail, those kinds of things. And of course, if the family is back in town, finding someone who can provide meals is a real big help for families. And there's more ideas again about that at my website, differentdream.com. There are some posts. If you just go in and search for meal preparation, you'll get some links to other sites that can help you organize meals. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later also. So that's number 4, help with the logistics a family of kids with special needs faces. Number 5, families often need a contact person who gets scheduled updates and disseminates information to the rest of the church body. If you've ever been in the hospital with a sick child, you know that you just managed to get them down to sleep and somebody calls wanting to get an update on how things are going. It's even worse now that we have cell phones than it was before we had cell phones because everybody calls. But if you can assign one person who calls once a day or who the parent will call once a day, that person can get the updates and then can send that information via email, text, whatever, to everybody else who's praying for the family and keep everyone informed. Another thing that that person can do is help the family set up a website, a web page, either at caringbridge.com or carepages.com. Both of those are free services that families who have kids with medical needs or any kind of problems like that can go in and set up a page. At that page, then they're able to upload photos, and the families can go in, and the children, if they're old enough, can go in and type daily entries about how things are going. And then it also has a guest book where people can go to that page and leave encouraging notes for the family and the child. So if the family is in the midst of trying to care for the child, you can help them get that set up. You can train them on how to use it, and they'll have much better communication with people around them. And that is so important for families who have kids with special needs. It keeps them from being isolated. Number 6, and this, we're going to sit on this topic and talk about it for a while now. I'm going to be on this one for a little bit. Families need a church body that will allow them to grieve for a very long time. Now, I've already mentioned grief before. It's very important for ministry workers to understand that parents are grieving, whether their child has a short-term, a chronic, or a terminal diagnosis. Those parents and those families are suffering from a loss of dreams for their child, and they will need to grieve. Church needs to help families through this grieving process because it very often leads to a spiritual crisis on the part of the parents. They find that they have questions about their faith they've never faced before, and they need answers to these very serious questions. And how they choose to answer those questions and respond to the crisis often leads to a redefining of the parent's relationship with God, and that is going to have a profound effect on the entire family's spiritual life. Either the parent's faith will grow or be abandoned, and most likely the child's faith will either grow or be abandoned. So we as a church have a really important job here of ministering to the family on a spiritual level to help them through that crisis. Now, to give you a little bit of an idea about what it's like for families who are losing their dreams for their children, I want to read to you a section of my book, A Different Dream for My Child, Meditations for Parents of Critically and Chronically Ill Children. This came out in 2009. And one of the families that I interviewed was actually from the town where we live. And I want to read to you just a little bit about their experience with changing dreams and grieving. Doug and Brenda's dreams have changed often since their children were born. When Jeff was born in 1982, they didn't know he had any medical issues, but he was very weak, and he spent a month in the hospital. Doug says that at that point we didn't like it, and we didn't know why it happened, but I thought, okay, I can probably get through this. As time went on, physical therapy didn't resolve Jeff's physical issues, and he was diagnosed with arthrogryposis, a genetic disorder that affects joints and muscles. Brenda says that's when their expectations for Jeff began to change. I could remember we'd always say, well, okay, Jeff can't be a football player when we found out about the physical aspect, but he'll be a doctor. Their perspective shifted again later when Jeff's developmental delays, a condition completely separate from the arthrogryposis, was confirmed. Doug said accepting the second diagnosis was difficult. The physical limitations you could work around. The mental limitations were much more serious. A year and a half after Jeff was born, before his developmental delays were evident, Doug and Brenda decided to add to their family. Doctors said they had a 1 in 4 chance of having another child with a similar physical condition. So Brenda prayed, please, God, don't let me get pregnant if anything's going to happen. When she discovered she was expecting again, she thought God had honored her prayer. After all, the baby in her womb was more active than Jeff had been a few years earlier. Brenda describes her daughter's birth in 1984. I could see Doug after Jessica was born. I remember the look on his face. She was affected too. but I didn't know how much. Once more, their dreams changed, even though their little girl's physical limitations were less severe than Jeff's, and her mental abilities were not affected at all. According to Doug, it's not always easy to embrace the new reality that accompanies a diagnosis. I wasn't able to experience a lot of things you'd normally expect to experience with a son. It's somewhat the same with Jessica. At times, I almost feel like I've missed out on something. But from the other side of it, we've had experiences nobody else in the world would ever know unless they have a special needs child. So, there are trade-offs. As you can see through that story, Brenda and Doug's dreams for their children changed over and over, and grief was part of that, adjusting to that process of change. Now, grief is often triggered by little things in families like Doug and Brenda's family. Things like the fact that their child is in the hospital on a birthday and they don't get to have a birthday party. Missing their first Halloween, not getting to buy that little costume and dress their child up. Not being able to enroll their child in Little League or swimming lessons. And as the child gets older and older and their age peers progress to adulthood and start experiencing things a child with special needs may not experience, parents grieve again when they go to weddings and graduations that their child's age peers are celebrating. And another thing is that parents who aren't facing a terminal diagnosis often don't recognize that what they're dealing with is grief. They just think they're a little depressed, and they think they're sad. And they also think that they have no right to be sad or to be depressed because their child is alive when somebody else's child with the same condition may not be living anymore. And so then they start feeling guilty about these feelings of sadness and grief, and it just gets to be a vicious circle. Well, now that we know a little bit about what grief looks like in families of kids with special needs, let's talk now about what the church has done in the past for families of kids who are grieving. And unfortunately, we have not been very compassionate in the church about that grief process. Unless a child's illness is terminal, and even after a child dies and we think parents should be done grieving, the church usually offers two responses to illness and grief. First, we often condemn the situation as a result of sin. And if you look at the beginning of John 9, you'll see that the disciples did that even in the presence of Jesus. But if we respond that way, we are going to drive families away from the church. My parents, after my dad was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and he'd had it for a few years, had a visit from a gentleman who was a church-going man who came in and told my parents that the reason Dad was not being healed of his multiple sclerosis was because he had unconfessed and unrepentant sin in his life, and if he would just dig down and confess that, he would get better. Now, it's been 50 years since that happened, but when my mom recounts it, she has a look of disgust on her face. And for the last 50 years, she has had a deep distrust of anyone in the church because someone condemned her husband's illness as sin. We need to be very careful as a church that we don't do that. Another thing that churches tend to do that's not very helpful is we refuse to allow people to be sad. We won't allow sadness. I don't know if you've heard of Nancy Guthrie. She's the author of the book Holding On to Hope and several other books about grief and sorrow in families who've lost children. They have 3 children. Their one son, Matt, is living and is a typical child, but they lost their second child and first daughter, Hope, to a condition called Zellweger's syndrome. It is a cellular disorder that the cells break down, and children who have that disorder, which is genetic, their bodies slowly fail. Their daughter had a type that they knew within 6 months she would die. So their daughter Hope was born, they took her home and cared for her until she died at about 6 months. Because it was a genetic disorder, they decided to have no more children, and they took those precautions, and even so, Nancy found herself pregnant again with another child. This child, Gabriel, was diagnosed when he was in utero as having the same syndrome. So they knew that when he was born, they would take him home and care for him until he died, which they did until he was about 6 months old. So she's written extensively on this topic, and even she and her husband even do respite retreats for parents who have lost children. And she was interviewed a while back by the Gospel Coalition blog on the topic of sad people, sad churches. And here's what she has to say about the church and its approach to sad people. Because I've been a sad person, I know what it is to look to my church for companionship, practical help, prayer support, and theological clarity in the midst of overwhelming and perplexing sorrow. I remember attending a church choir retreat 3 months after burying my daughter and saying to the group, I am not sinking into depression. I haven't lost my faith. I'm just sad, and I need you to let me be sad. The truth is, most of us are uncomfortable with sadness, as individuals and as churches. We want to fix people and help them feel better, and we are far less patient than God is with the process he uses to bring healing. Well, if those are two things that the church is doing and needs to stop doing, what should we be doing instead in the arena of grief and parents of kids with special needs? Well, first of all, we need to be able to name, acknowledge, and allow parents to grieve. So we need to know something about the grief process. And then we need to support families as they process that grief. So we should be familiar with the grief process and its stages, and I'm just going to quickly tell you what those stages are now. If you're using the handout that you were able to download earlier, you can fill these stages in on your handout sheet. They are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Now I'll run through those really quickly again. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Now I could do a whole workshop just on what those stages of grief look like in parents of kids with special needs, but I don't have time for now. But I am going to recommend that if you're interested in learning more, you read the book On Grief and Grieving by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and you will find that book listed at the end of the handouts in the bibliography section. So other things, now that you know what the stages of grief are, you should also as church body be anticipating those grief triggers we talked about earlier. Things like birthday parties, everybody else's child being able to walk and yours not, attending a wedding for someone and knowing that this family has a child who's the same age who's never going to get married. Anticipate those grief triggers and then send little encouraging cards or notes or just, I'm thinking of you, or wondering if this is a hard time for you. Just send those notes now and then. Not just right after a diagnosis and after a family starts to adjust, but for years and years into the future. Another thing you need to do is let the family talk about their grief, but be sure to follow the family's lead. If they're ready to talk about it, you be ready to listen. If they're not ready, back off and bring up the subject again later and see if they're ready then. Allow the family plenty of time to work through their grief, and be sure to use scripture to show families that grief is not sin. Now again, I don't have a lot of time here to go into what those scriptures are, but there is a chapter in my new book, Different Dream Parenting, that deals with that subject and has lots of scriptural references, and you can look there. Nancy Guthrie also does a great job in her books, which are also listed in the bibliography, so you can find scriptural support about grief and sin. Okay, let's move on to number 7 now, which is about guilt, closely related to grief, and we're going to spend some time talking about this one too. Families also need scriptural assurance when battling guilt, because after a diagnosis or as the caregiving goes on and on for a child with special needs, parents often feel a great deal of guilt. This is probably the biggest spiritual battle that they face. And first we're going to run through a few causes of guilt. Inadequacy is one. Parents don't feel that they're equipped or able to care for their child as well as is needed. They blame themselves for their child's illness or condition. We talked about that a little bit already. They have survivor guilt. Again, we mentioned that one before. Why should I feel grief, or why should I feel bad or sad when my child's alive, somebody else lost their child? They feel guilt about the what ifs. What if they'd made this decision instead of that one? What if they'd done this more quickly? What if? Leads to a lot of guilt. Often they feel guilt because they resent the care demands their child has and the way it's changed their life. They feel guilt because they can't fix what's wrong with their child. And one of the jobs of a parent is to fix things. So they feel a lot of guilt because they're failing at their job. They feel guilt because they're angry with God. They feel guilt because they resent their spouse, perhaps, who has accepted the situation better than they've accepted it themselves. And they feel guilt because they're envious of other families who don't have to deal with the issues that they're dealing with. There's many more causes for guilt, but those are some of the ones I hear about the most. Now, part of the battle of helping parents fight this battle of guilt is determining whether the guilt is founded or unfounded, whether there's a real reason to be guilty, or if it is just the spiritual warfare and deception. So to do that, when you meet with families or when you talk to them, you need to pray together first and ask God to reveal the truth. Then take some time to see what God's Word says about guilt. And again, I don't have time to go into that deeply here today. And again, there is a chapter in my book, Different Dream Parenting, that does examine the Scriptures and does go into that a little more deeply. And after you've done some looking at God's Word and you've been reading some of those Scriptures, compare those Scriptures to the parent's life and have them look for any evidence of disobedience. Are they being disobedient to the Scripture? Or do they have some misconceptions? Look for some evidence of misconception, which is probably quite likely. They probably do have some misconceptions on what guilt is and isn't. And then have them seek counsel. You may be able to be the one who gives the counsel. You may refer them on to a professional counselor or a pastor or someone else, another parent who's dealt with these issues. Because if they seek counsel and talk to someone about these feelings, very often that is going to dispel the guilt better than anything. This happened to me when our son was young. I felt very guilty about his illness, and there was one time when I finally, after months and months of bottling it up, talked to my husband and told him, I think it must be my fault. I did this and I did this, and you're up with him at night, and I'm not a very good mother. I'm his mother. I should be doing that. You shouldn't be. Finally, Hiram just stopped me and said, Jolene, stop. Those are lies. You are a good mother and you're doing a good job. And just being able to share my feelings and have him give me some affirmation was enough to dispel the guilt. So seek counsel when you need it. Now, after you've done those steps, if the guilt is founded, if there is a reason for the parent to feel guilty, perhaps their child has fetal alcohol syndrome. Perhaps there was some physical abuse that led to an injury. And this happens very rarely that the guilt is founded, but when it is, parents need to confess their sin, repent, and then move on. That's the parents' part. Churches need to help by forgiving, and that can be really hard to do in some cases. They need to provide accountability to keep the parents from doing that again, and encourage counseling or help provide the means for them to get counseling or treatment so that they don't fall into those old patterns again. Now, more often, the guilt is unfounded, and in those cases, the church needs to assist the family by using that scriptural truth I talked about before to disarm the enemy. Help them see what the truth is, what they're hearing in their head, what's truth, and what are lies, so they can just disarm the enemy and move forward in truth. Okay, that was number 7. Now let's go on to number 8. These last 3 we're going to go through pretty quickly. Number 8, families need to feel accepted and safe. It's really important that the church does not judge a parent's parenting ability by the child's behavior. Because very often these children are suffering from behavior disorders or mental illnesses. So when they bring their child into church and they're off the wall, we automatically think, well, they're not doing a very good job of parenting their child. What we don't realize is that they're very good parents. and they have done so much to improve that child's behavior. And if they weren't the parents, how much worse would that child's behavior be? So we need to avoid those parenting judgments that we're so quick to make if we want parents to feel accepted and safe in our churches. We need to provide confidential support groups for them where they can talk about their issues and share and get new ideas and network. We need to provide accountability partners to call them and see how things are going, to pray with them, to ask for prayer requests. And we need to provide some kind of small group fellowship that they can participate in and have that family feeling from their church. Number 9 goes along with this one. Families need accessibility and support so they can attend these church events. They need programs that the children can participate in, Sunday school programs that allow them to participate and meet their needs, respite programs where the children can come and stay for a while and be watched by someone capable so the families can get away for a little while, or maybe just some kind of childcare options. I think about Doug and Brenda. Their son Jeff is a young adult now and he still lives with them, and it was very hard for them to attend small group functions. So their small church group just decided that they would always meet at Doug and Brenda's house. Then they didn't have to find care, and different people would bring the meals in, and that worked out very well. So we need to be flexible and figure out those ways so that families of kids with special needs can be involved in church life. And number 10 is kind of a summing up of what we've talked about in many ways already. Families need to be ministered to for a long, long time. Churches are really good when there's a crisis at coming in and lifting up a family and helping them through that crisis. But after the crisis ends, after the funeral's over, after the child's home from the hospital and receiving care at home, churches tend to forget. People in churches tend to peter out. We don't call anymore. We don't take meals anymore. We don't send cards anymore. And the families are in this for the long haul. They need our support for a long, long time, as long as their child is part of their life. And some things that can help a church do that are very easy. One that has been implemented in our church a couple times, not for special needs children, but this would work very well for those families, is a monthly calendar. We have a woman in our church whose husband unfortunately committed suicide about 6 or 7 months ago. And within a few months, somebody had called around, and people had volunteered to take one day of each month. My day is the 10th of every month. And on that day, I think about this woman. I send her an email, ask what I can pray for. I send her a card. And sometimes I just give her a call, and we chat a little bit. And then you do that day of every month. We also do this for a woman who's dealing with stage 4 cancer. At the end of the year, then, you need to go through and review that list and check with the people who have volunteered to see if they're willing to continue, if they've moved, if we need a replacement, and so forth. But that's a good way to keep that support going month after month, year after year. Another thing that you can do individually is just think of some of those families and send cards on special dates, or just to encourage them. There are some families that God's laid on my heart, and every year on the anniversary of a child's death or when they got the diagnosis, I just send a card and tell them I'm thinking about them. I also send a card maybe at Christmas or at Easter or around the child's birthday, just to let them know that child is remembered and they're remembered, and I'm thinking about that situation. We individually can do that very easily. And finally, the last thing that churches can do is maybe come up with a way to get meals out once a month to the family. There are a couple really good websites that are listed in the handout that you have. One is caringmeals.com, and the other is takethemeal.com. And these are products that you can use, and they're free, to help schedule meals from different people in your church to take over. It keeps track of who's taken what and when, and it sends reminders so that people remember to take the food. And another really good thing that you can do with this, if you decide to take a meal over, you might even ask the family if they'd like you to come and stay and eat with them. That's a good way to get them company. And some families like that, some don't. Well, there you have it. Those are 10 ways that family or churches can minister to families of kids who have special needs. I encourage you to look through your handouts and look at the bibliography there. There's a lot of resources. And I want to mention to you also that my new book, Different Dream Parenting, A Practical Guide for Raising a Child with Special Needs, has just been released. I'm videotaping this a little bit before November, and the book is released on November 1st, so I don't even have a copy of the book to hold up and show you. But it is available now, and if you go to the Inclusion Fusion store, you can see a picture of the cover of the book, and you can order it at the special website summit price. And if you order it now, that price includes shipping and handling, and I will also sign the book because I will be the one getting those orders and filling them. And I would really encourage you to get that book and look through it. It's going to help flesh out a lot of what we've talked about today. It also makes a great gift for parents of kids who have special needs because it is full of practical resources for families, anything from getting the diagnosis to planning special needs trust for your child as they're approaching adulthood, and everything in between. IEP meetings, care meetings at the hospital, and anything else you can think of is in there. So I want to thank you for listening to me today and for taking part in the Inclusion Fusion Summit. I think it's a great idea, and I hope that maybe you'll visit my website and leave me an email there. You can contact me through my website about things you have done, other ideas that you have, or ideas that you've received here that you think are going to work well for your church. Thank you so much, and have a great day. Bye-bye.